Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kenneth Pinkerton, and I am the Director of Charities and Third Sector here at Brodie's. So this morning we are addressing key issues in relation to cyber risk, data protection, and ePrivacy compliance. And I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Martin Sloan. Martin is a partner in our commercial services unit, specialising in technology, outsourcing, intellectual property and information law. He's a member of the policy working group for the Scottish IT industry trade body, Scotland IS, and is also a member of the advisory board for the Society for Computers and the Law. He chairs the Law Society of Scotland's Electronic Signatures Working Group, which recently published a guide on electronic signatures under Scots law, very important at the moment. He's also accredited by the Law Society of Scotland in relation to cybersecurity. So Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Kenneth, and good morning. So what I want to do over the next sort of half an hour or so is do a very quick refresher on data protection and ePrivacy. Those of you who have heard or been to our seminars before will recognise some of this content, but I think it's useful just to remind yourselves of the key issues in terms of data and ePrivacy compliance. And then the main part of this morning's session is really going to be focusing on cyber risk and what you and your organisation can do to be ready and alert to cyber risk issues, and what you should be doing if you do suffer a cyber incident. And as Kenneth says, we will take some questions at the end. So first of all, just a quick recap on data protection law. I thought it was helpful just to remind yourselves of the data protection principles, because this is really what data protection law is all about. And it's a good reminder, say, just when thinking about what you're doing within your organisation, about thinking about the key risks, the key issues, and the questions you want to ask your colleagues, your fellow trustees, board members, or whatever around what you're doing to ensure that the processing is compliant. So the first principle that we should be following is that any personal data process should be done so in a fair and lawful and transparent manner. So that's really ensuring that you have clear privacy notices in place, you're telling people what you're doing, you're ensuring that you have a clear legal basis for doing that. And that legal basis will vary depending on whether you're processing, say, for fundraising purposes, or you're processing staff information, or whether it's perhaps service users or whatever. So really important you understand what your legal basis is. Secondly, whatever you process, you should only process for that purpose and not for anything that's incompatible with that. So if you collect information for one reason, you can't then go on and use it for something else that's unconnected with that. Thirdly, you should only collect what information is necessary for that purpose. So it's the data minimization principle. And then you should ensure that whatever you have is kept accurate and where necessary, up to date. And then that information you should only hold for as long as it's necessary. So it's really important to have in place clear data retention policies. And as we'll see when we go on to talk about cyber risk, one of the best ways of managing your risk is actually to ensure you don't hold more information than you need in the first place, because if you don't hold it, you can't lose it, it can't be compromised. So really important to look at your data retention policies. And then the sixth principle is around data security. And again, we'll talk a bit about this later on, but just ensuring that you are keeping your data secure. And remember, of course, that the test here is not when you're looking at what are appropriate organizational and technical measures, you're not looking at the risk of an incident happening, but more actually what is the risk to the individual if that information is compromised. So if you are a charity which works, say, with vulnerable people, then the information you hold on them will be subject to a much higher expectation in terms of how you keep that secure versus, say, the names of people that are signed up to get your marketing updates on your fundraising campaign. So it's really important you look at the level of security relative to the information you're actually holding. And then the final principle here is around accountability. And this is a really important one, which came in with GDPR a few years ago. And that's that you need to be able to demonstrate how you comply with all of this. And as I said to people, if anyone attended any of our GDPR training, that really the two things that GDPR was all about was increasing transparency, so being clear with people about what you're doing, and improving accountability. So this obligation that you actually now have to be able to demonstrate that you are complying and that you're doing the right things. You're not just complying by way of of luck or by chance. And then we also have ePrivacy laws, and these sit alongside data protection law, and they regulate a number of very specific things. And quite often they get confused with data protection law, but it's important to remember that they are different. So what's ePrivacy about? Well, firstly, this is the law that regulates electronic marketing. So if you're marketing by email or by text message to someone, then you need to have prior consent to that marketing. There is something called the soft opt-in, which you may have heard about and you may see online retailers using, and that's the thing that says if you buy goods or services from someone and you collect details in the course of buying those goods or services, then you can send them marketing about subsequent goods or services in the future, provided you give them the opportunity to opt out. And it's the principle that really confuses people, because it's the one bit where opt-out is okay, whereas we were all told with GDPR opt-out is very bad, we must have opt-in. The soft opt-in allows you to use opt-out, but it doesn't apply to, it only applies to provision of goods or services, so it doesn't apply to what most charities and third sector organisations will be doing, for example, in relation to fundraising campaigns and things like that in dealing with donors. So it's really important that when you are collecting information from donors and supporters, that you get their consent to, or you request consent for future marketing if that's what you want to do. The privacy regulations also deal with use of cookies on websites, which obviously is something we're seeing a lot about in the press at the moment, and tracking on websites, but also in mobile apps, and also email tracking as well, which is one that's often forgotten about. But if you are using tracking to find out who opens your emails, where they are, what they do with it, what links to click on, then that's regulated by the same rules as well. And again, as with electronic marketing, there's a requirement for prior consent to that if it's for non-essential purposes. And there's lots of guidance out there in terms of what is essential and not essential on our blog, which we'll link to at the end. And then the third thing that's covered by ePrivacy is around unsolicited calls and using automated calling, where you have a computer that dials someone's number and then plays a pre-recorded message. If you're doing telephone marketing, so unsolicited calls, then you need to remember about the telephone preference service and screening the numbers against that before you call them. And then if you're using automated calling, then it's important to remember you need to have prior consent to use that as well. So I've got on screen here just a few sort of key issues and things that we see coming up with clients in the charities and third sector. Data collection, I mentioned earlier, this is really important around being transparent about what you're doing. Look at your privacy notice, make sure it's up to date, make sure you're being clear with individuals about what you're doing, because something you drafted 2 or 3 years ago may no longer be up to date in terms of explaining how and why you're collecting information. If you're doing fundraising or marketing, then I say it's really important to ensure you've got consent if you want to market electronically. Profiling and targeting is something that I know some charities do. They do donor profiling or prospecting before they contact someone. It's really important to look at how you do that, what information you're getting, how you're being transparent about that. And I know that's a big challenge, because you want to ensure that you've identified whether, say, a high net worth individual is the right person to contact before you do that. So it's important you just make sure your processes in that are okay, and that you're being transparent in what you're doing. Marketing lists, there are many people out there who will sell you lists of potential people that you might want to contact. Using that becomes much harder after GDPR because of the rules in terms of transparency and consent. And more often than not, if you start asking questions on the provider of the list, then actually they're not able to provide specific consent for you to carry out that marketing. So use those with care. Policies, processes, and training. So this is the key bit around accountability. So who is it within your organization who's responsible for actually managing data protection compliance? You may not need to have a data protection officer, but you should still have someone who is taking on that responsibility in terms of managing compliance and being the person that leads on all of that. Look at the policies and procedures you have in place to ensure you can deal with data subject rights. You can train staff on what they need to know, that staff are aware of, say, how to handle data and what to do if a question or complaint is raised. Partnership arrangements. So I know that some charities will share data with other organisations. They will have partnership arrangements. If personal data is being shared with that, then it's really important to be clear on what the roles and responsibilities are of each party and ensuring that they are clearly documented. Otherwise, you end up in a position where no one's quite clear as to who's doing what to ensure compliance. Data security, so I mentioned before around how that test is determined, and we'll talk a bit more about this in relation to cyber later on. But it's a key issue here and one to keep continuously under review. Data retention, again, as I mentioned, is really important to ensure that you are looking at how long you're holding data for, that you're not retaining any of that data for longer than is necessary, and you're looking at why you collected that data and then how long you need to retain it, because you have different periods applying to different sorts of data. If you have third-party agencies doing processing for you, or you've got data processors, then make sure your contracts with those are robust. I think it's now pretty standard that most of the big providers of online services you might use will have GDPR compliant wording in them, but you'll probably also find in terms of things like allocation of liability that they will take a very harsh line, and you need to be comfortable that you are comfortable with the level of risk that you've been asked to take on by contracting with them. And then finally, in relation to data subject requests, ensure your staff are properly trained in how to handle these. So that's the rights of individuals to get a copy of the information that you hold about them, so a data subject access request. They have a right to object to processing. They have a right to have their processing restricted in certain circumstances. They have a right in certain circumstances to have their information deleted. And it's really important that you understand when each of those apply and you have a process for dealing with them. I say a lot of these requests are qualified, so they don't always apply in each occasion. So it's important to understand how you actually deal with those and recognize them when they come in. Okay, so the second part of this morning's session is looking at cyber risk, which I know is becoming an increasing risk issue. So what is it? Well, I think fundamentally this is now a key business risk that should be on the agenda at board meetings. So it should be a standing item to look at and be aware of. And the reason for that is the impact that it could have on an organisation. What do we mean by cyber risk? Well, I suppose it's any exposure to harm or loss that might arise from a breach or an attack on IT systems. And it's not just about personal data. So yes, data protection law regulates what you must do in relation to keeping personal data secure. And it also has a regime in terms of reporting personal data breaches to the Information Commissioner's Office. But cyber risk is much broader than that. It could be something which there may not be any impact on personal data, but it may impact organizationally upon what you're doing. So it could be your email systems, it could be your CRM systems for dealing with supporters or donors or others with whom you interact. It could be file storage. It could be other operational systems. So if you have a workforce management system that you use to manage when your employees or volunteers do particular things, rota organization or whatever, it could affect those systems as well. And it can affect lots of different groups of individuals. So it could be your staff, whether that's employees, volunteers, or trustees. It could be service users or service beneficiaries, the people that you work with. It could be your supporters. It could be your donors as well. So each of them could be affected by a cyber incident. And it can take many different forms. So it could be a targeted attack because someone has decided they want to specifically target your organization. It might be a system vulnerability, so it might just be a quirk in your system and it is just exploited by someone who is acting in an opportunist fashion. A sort of a drive-by attack, if you like. It could be an insider threat, so you have an employee or someone in your workforce who's gone rogue, who perhaps is aggrieved about something and decides to do something to compromise your organization. And I think the most common one we hear about is phishing attacks these days. So that's where your employees will receive an email which purports to be on something and a link they have to click on. And there's many different forms of these. The original one was the Nigerian prince many years ago, but they're now much more sophisticated in terms of invoice requests that purport to be from senior management, or it could be something that pretends to be your bank or whatever. And they're very, very clever. They all use social engineering to look as authentic as possible, and then get someone to click on the link, enter some details, and nothing may happen immediately. It may be weeks or months before anything happens on it, but suddenly you've got credentials there, and it allows someone to do something to your system or get access to it. There's lots of really good training out there, and it's really important that your staff know what they should and shouldn't be doing. It could be a zero-day attack, so by that I mean attacking exploiting a vulnerability in a system that no one knew about. And there have been a number of these over the years. There was one involving Microsoft Exchange very recently, where that exploited an issue that no one had previously identified. Or it could be an exploitation of a known or unpatched vulnerability. So yeah, sometimes when issues are identified with software or services, then the provider will issue a patch to send out to update the systems. And then if people will then try and exploit that. So it's really important that you ensure that you're regularly patching your systems to download the latest version or deal with security issues that are identified. Or it could just be an exploitation of weak security, poor password control, not using two-factor authentication to log into a system, things like that, where people exploit vulnerabilities. And it might be systems you run yourself, or it could be third-party systems that you use. And why do you need to worry about it? Well, here's the headline that was in the BBC News from last year. Blackbaud is a big, I think they're American-owned CRM provider who provide CRM systems to a number of universities and charities, and they were hacked last summer. And you see that was headline news, and a number of very large organizations were hit by that. And that's not great for your reputation. It's not great for the people that you work with on that. Blackbaud's kind of interesting when we have a couple of clients with this. They pretty clear they had limited knowledge of what had actually gone on and didn't share a huge amount of information, which made it very difficult for people to actually work out what had happened to the information. And I think we're still awaiting the outcome of full investigations on that. Sorry. So what's the risk? Well, as I say, look at that BBC News story. So reputational risk is absolutely key here. If your data is not kept secure, your systems aren't secure, then that impacts not just on people you might be working with, so your service users, but also your supporters, your donors. If you don't keep the data secure, they may be less likely to donate money to support you. Operational, this is the other key risk. A cyber attack can take an organization out for a few minutes maybe, or maybe days, weeks, even months. And we've seen reports in the press recently about some organizations who have been suffering issues for 3-4 months following a cyber attack because they've lost control to all the data. It's all been encrypted. They can't get it back. They can't get back to their core systems. And if you think about how dependent you are as an organization on IT, then you will have a feel for the level of interruption or impact that may have on your organization. Financial, so there are cleanup costs to all of this in terms of investigating the breach, in terms of fixing your systems, restoring data. There's lost management time with all of this, and then potentially also claims from individuals if they have suffered as a consequence of this. And then regulatory. So we've got the Information Commissioner, as mentioned. If it involves personal data, then there would be there's a requirement to notify the Information Commissioner of a personal data breach unless it's unlikely to be a risk to the individuals. But it may also be required an OSCAR notification as well, so it may be a notifiable event depending on the impact of that incident on your charity. So what can you do to try and deal with all of this? Well, the first step is understand what systems do you have, what steps are in place to protect them, what are you actually doing, where's your data held, what do you need to actually be alert to. If you're using third parties, then ensure you've carried out appropriate diligence of those third party suppliers. So you understand, you've asked for information about their information security practices, the tests that they do, and that you're exercising oversight in that. And then really important here is around business continuity and disaster recovery. So cyber attacks do happen. It's a case of when, usually not if, but there's a lot you can do to actually ensure that you are you can put steps in place to mitigate the impact of them. So that might be ensuring your data is properly backed up. It might be having it backed up in more than one place. It might be understanding what you do if a system goes down, what's your workaround to that, so you can quickly move and continue to operate. So planning on this is absolutely key. Have an incident response team. So that might be some people internally. So that might be from your IT department. It might be operational people. It might be marketing people. In-house legal if you have an internal legal team. All the experts on that side, but also your external advisors as well. So by that I mean external lawyers, PR consultants, forensic investigators, etc., etc. So work out what your team is and identify who it is, so that if you do have an incident, you can move quickly, because that's what's key here, is being able to move quickly when something happens. Develop an incident response plan, so have a plan that you have available, so that you have a process to follow when the worst happens, and you've got checklists you can go through, you know what to do, rather than having to make it up as you go along. And then following on from that is staff training is really important. So I talked before about being alert to things like phishing attacks, but also ensuring your staff know what to do to if there is a cyber incident. Who do they contact? What should they do? How should they deal with that? Insurance cover is really important here to understand what coverage you have. So a lot of insurers will provide cyber cover as part of their business insurance coverage, but it's really important you understand the terms of that in terms of what it gives access to. So it may give you access to, say, forensic IT experts, cyber experts that you can call upon as part of your incident response team. But there might also be expectations in terms of things you have to do in order for the coverage to actually apply. So going back before, to around what systems you have, what are you doing to ensure that they are secure? If you haven't done those, you may find your insurance doesn't actually cover your instance. So make sure you look at your coverage and you understand what you've got. And regularly review all your systems and plans and procedures, because these things change, technology changes, there are new ways of doing stuff, there's new ways of monitoring for breaches, systems change. So if you're relying upon particularly old software, it might be time to upgrade that and move to a more secure system. Don't necessarily be afraid of using the cloud for your IT. I know that there's a lot of data protection concerns around that, but actually a cloud hosted system may well be a lot more secure than what you can do internally. So yeah, it's a case of really looking at what you're doing, what works best for your organization. But if you have old systems that are pretty dated or not being supported anymore, then that should be a warning bell to review them and check your plans and procedures and make sure they work. They're really good desktop exercises you can do, and I'll link sometime later on around how you can test how you respond in these situations. And you may find actually in the back of that you want to update your processes to learn from that experience. I don't know how this slide will come across on screen, but this is from the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is a UK government organisation which has a number of functions, but one of them is to improve cybersecurity practice, and they produce a lot of really good guidance. And I've got here their small charity guide, which is a great one-page summary of some of the easy things you can do on the technical side to reduce the risk of you being compromised. There's a link to it at the end. You can download it, but it's certainly worth having a read. So what do you do if the worst does happen? Well, the first thing, try not to panic. You probably will, but try not to panic. Hopefully you'll have an incident response plan and your team ready, and you can implement that. But I've tried to break down on this slide kind of the key steps, the things that I think that you want to try and do, and work out a priority for them. So the first thing to do in that first hour is to try and contain the incident. So quite often these things spread through your network. So once you become aware of an incident, the best thing to do is to try and contain that. That might be switching things off. It might be disabling access to your staff until you worked out what the problem is, and try and contain it within a particular area within your IT environment. Get your incident response team together, and then implement your incident response plan. So look at the plan, the steps you're going to take, and then follow that through. And look at whatever initial mitigation you can do in that. So I say that might be switching some things off. It might be using a disaster recovery facility you have access to. It might be implementing some other sort of workaround. but it's really important to try and contain that as best you can. And then once you've done that, you'll be looking at your risk assessment in terms of what is the actual impact here. So is this just a small incident that you can manage because it's just, say, one person who's fallen for a phishing attack, you've been able to disable that mailbox and you don't think it goes any further than that? Or is this, say, an organization-wide incident affecting everyone, in which case you're going to have to work out how you deal with that and look at a plan to recover. Liaise early with your insurers. So I can't emphasize this enough, but if you have insurance cover, then it's best to speak to them as soon as possible so they know about that and you have them on board in the process. And I know from the past, and having seen other experiences in the past where people have been a bit slow with dealing with the insurers, that they're almost afraid of contacting them, and that doesn't work well, because then the insurers feel they're not getting all the information. It's much better to contact them as soon as possible and then get access to all the support that they can provide through their network, because you probably don't have an in-house forensic team, but your insurer will be able to provide you with someone through that. So do engage your insurer as soon as possible to deal with that. And then implement those workarounds or disaster recovery plans I mentioned to try and continue, if it's possible, with day-to-day business. And then in terms of second day and subsequent, it very much depends on what has actually happened and what the impact is on your organization, I say, depending whether it's a small scale incident or whether it's something which has a wider impact. You might need to consider notifying the regulators, so that'd be the Information Commissioner's Office. It might also be OSCR, depending on the impact. You might need to think about PR, so you might want to think about how you engage third parties. You may have an obligation to notify individuals under data protection law, or you might want to have a press statement ready to go if anyone asks questions. So you want to think about what your strategy is for that. And then beyond that, once it's all over, review and learn from the incident. So even if it is just a small incident, and the issue was that you didn't have two-factor authentication implemented on something, or it's another easy fix, work out why that was the case, why you didn't do that previously, and work out whether there are other similar issues that you should be looking at to review similar vulnerabilities. So really important to review and learn, and then take appropriate remedial action. Okay, so in terms of our key recommendations, so first one is know your data in your system. So this, if you don't know what systems you have and you don't know what data you have, then you can't know what it is you need to do to protect those. So if you're a trustee or on the board, these are the questions you should be asking the charity to tell you about what systems do you have, what data you have. And remember, all data is important. So this is not just about personal data. There'll be lots of other data that you hold, which could be, if it's compromised, could cause an issue. Know where your key vulnerabilities are. So understanding, are your vulnerabilities your systems? Are they your people? Where are the weak points? Where could something happen that impacts on your organization? Understand your insurance position. So know what cover you have, know what you need to do to exercise that cover, know what you get through it. Have an incident management team. I say that will likely be a combination of internal people and also external people. And be prepared. So do your testing. The National Cybersecurity Centre has some really good, as I mentioned, exercises in a box, which you can download and you can work through with senior management or the key people. It's really good to run through these, because they're a very good test of actually what you think you know and what you actually know. Test and test and test again. And training is really important here. A large number of cyber incidents arise through phishing attacks, and helping your staff to understand when something might be a phish is key here, and then helping them to know what to do when that happens is really important as well, because the sooner that can be escalated, the better. Ensure your policies are workable. So you'll have some policies that you'll develop for this sort of stuff. Ensure they actually work. The worst thing in the world is to have policies that are just templates that you fill in and send out without actually checking that they work for your organization. And finally, I say just think about that interaction with the regulators as well. It's really important that when an incident does occur, that you deal with your regulatory obligations, and ensure that you're transparent and clear with them, and you deal with them properly. The Information Commission will certainly encourage early interaction with them, and that's one of the things that they take into account as a mitigating factor if they do decide that there has been, say, a breach of data protection law. So it's good to be positive and not to hide stuff on that. Just a few points before we finish off and move on to the Q&A. So it's a couple of things here that are worth just flagging that we can do within Brody's. So we have a data protection self-assessment tool, which is a really useful way of checking where you are in terms of data protection compliance. It takes the form of an online self-assessment tool that you fill in the answers to, and we can then review that and give you a report based on that, and also some recommendations for actions to look at. And I know a number of clients within the charities and third sectors have found this a very useful thing. We also have a document toolkit of policies and other documents, and we have a specific grant giving charity version of that, which has bespoke documents for charities that are grant giving organisations. Policy reviews, so we can help you with that, and also support in handling dealing with data subject requests. I know that a lot of charities don't get these very often, and you can often find them quite challenging to deal with. So again, we can support in that. And also in terms of the cyber side, with readiness and response checklists and policies as well. I mentioned the NCSE, so the NCSE has a really useful charities guide, which is linked to there, which will take you through some of the more technical aspects of all of this. And they also have what they call the board toolkit, which is designed to help board members understand what they need to know about managing cyber risk and the questions to ask as well. So those are well worth looking at if you've not had a chance to do that. And Kenneth, that was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Martin. I'm sure everybody found that really useful. And I suppose from the charity law and governance perspective, the whole cyber risk data protection, I'm sure, will feature on everybody's risk register, and depending on what mitigating factors you've got in place will depend on where it will land, because ultimately it's a risk that we all have to accept at the moment. It's what we do about the bigger risk, how we mitigate it, and then what we're left with, the residual risk is possibly the important point. There are a few questions that have come in. The first one is on trustees using personal email addresses. You got a view on that? Should it be a personal email address, or should it be linked to the charity?
Yeah, this is one that actually comes up quite a lot, and the difficulty around allowing trustees to use their own personal email address is that the charity then loses control of the data that's shared through that. So you don't know whether the trustee is using their own personal email address, or whether it might be their work email address. But if information is being shared with them, particularly personal data, and I suppose it depends partly on what information is being shared with trustees. But if you're sharing, reports or other information, then that information is no longer in your network, so you can't control it. And if you go back from a data protection perspective around data retention and data security, it's outside your control because the trustee is holding it somewhere else. Now, if that's their work email address, it might be that their employer actually has good IT security practices in place, but I suspect that employer probably won't want potentially sensitive information relating to the charity's activities sitting on its system. And if it's their personal email address, well, you don't know whether their Gmail or Hotmail account has whether the password is password1 or whether it's something more secure than that, because you've got no control over it. So I think it's always much better, if possible, to provide trustees with an email address that's provided by the charity itself that they can log into. There are plenty of affordable ways of doing that now. It used to be much harder, but there are lots of solutions out there that allow that. But that then gives the charity much more control over that email account. And also, if you're sharing documents or information, particularly those that are sensitive, share it as a link with a secure login to a file sharing site, again, where you can keep control of that, rather than actually sending it as an attachment, where again you lose control. So the things you can do in that, which can make things a bit more secure. And also these things can help reducing people printing stuff as well, which is the other data risk with all this. People print all their minutes off before they then get on a train and then leave things on the train. So sharing it in an electronic way, in a secure way, can help deal with that as well.
And there's a supplementary question come up about that, asking, is using a Gmail address adequate for an organization that is shared between 11 people, one email address, and 11 people on its Gmail?
I haven't looked at Google's specific policies on this, so I think you would need to have a look at that. But I guess the question is, certainly Google will provide a pretty secure email service, provided you use a secure password on that. I'm sure that their IT infrastructure is pretty secure, because their business depends on that. If this is a shared email account that everyone is using, then that might, I guess, the charity may have control over that, so they can control the password everyone uses. But it's kind of hard to say, in isolation, is this kind of like an info at whatever, a shared account for general inquiries, or is it something that everyone's using? So probably need to know a bit more about it to give clear advice. But
Okay.
yeah, I think there's some things to look at with that.
And presumably when a charity trustee resigns, if they've been using their own personal email address and that's been allowed, you would, as a CEO or a board, you'd be asking them to delete everything to do with the charity. Yes,
yeah. Particularly if they've been storing it somewhere else, so on their own laptop or on in their personal account, you'd want to ensure that they are doing that. So there's nothing sitting there that they shouldn't have access to any longer.
Yeah, okay. So we've had another question. Would you recommend carrying out dark web monitoring as part of monitoring potential cyber risk to a charity?
So I think you could spend a lot of time doing dark web monitoring. For those of you who don't know, the dark web is the bit of the internet which is associated with all sorts of criminal activity, and it's not easily accessible. It's not accessible through a conventional web browser, but generally when an organization is hacked, the data that's hacked will end up in the dark web, and it's not a place to go unless you know what you're doing. I don't think you need to do monitoring of that on a routine basis unless you are aware of a particular incident. So if you suffer an attack, and you think you may have lost data, and the forensic experts will be able to tell you whether data has been downloaded or exfiltrated from your system, then yes, you might want to look at that point. But it certainly not as a sort of regular routine thing. It's not going to be realistic for most organizations to do that when there's no reason to suspect anything is there.
Okay. And most of us are now working from home and working virtually. Is there anything specific that's come up that we should be in general thinking about?
Yeah, so I suppose one thing in this is that a lot of organizations will have IT policies, but they probably didn't envisage the extent of working at home that we're doing at the moment. So first thing, check whether your policy actually allows people to work at home, because you may find it says you can't work at home. If people are working remotely, then what's been clear is that people will find, and this is not a COVID thing, but it's always been the case, people will always try and find the way to make their life easier. So and speak to your staff and understand what they're doing to work remotely. So are they doing things like using a personal email account? Are they emailing stuff to that account because it's easier to transfer a file because they can't do it otherwise? Are they storing stuff on their local laptop or whatever rather than one that you provided? All of these things give rise to potential security risks. And if people are doing things, the classic ones, people using unsecure Zoom a year ago when there were issues with the Zoom platform, and people were using it and not, well, there were some security issues with it, but also people weren't using it properly. So if people are using communication tools, provide them with guidance on which ones they should use, and then how to use them securely. So it's really just a case, I think, of looking at what policies you have in place and best practice out there. Again, the NCSC guidance is quite good on some of this stuff. And ask your people what they're doing.
Yeah.
What are they doing with the data, and what can you do to help them make their life easier?
Okay, and I'm conscious of time, so one final question I'll take, which is, if and this is from me, what would be your one takeaway thing to, whether it's charity trustees or whether it's senior leadership teams, from your seminar? What's the one thing that they should go away and check or go away and do?
So number one thing is put this on your standing agenda for your board. If you've not covered it previously, then have this as an item to talk about and ask the questions, because the people who are at the board meeting probably won't necessarily know the answers to this, but understand who it is that is responsible within the organization for this, and find out what, do that risk assessment in terms of what, finding out what systems you use, what steps have been taken to ensure that they are being kept secure, and what your readiness is. And if you haven't taken the steps we talked about, then implement them.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. Well, that's us at the end of this webinar. I hope you've all found that useful. Our next webinar in this series is on the 28th of April at 2 p.m. and we'll be looking at health and safety issues for charities and the third sector. So please, if you're interested in that, do feel free to sign up there. Obviously, we're doing these things virtually, so the more the merrier, and all are welcome. Our details, Martin and my details, are on the screen there. If you want to get in touch with us, then please feel free to do so. And all that remains is for me to say is thank you for coming along today. I hope you got something useful out of that. I'm sure you did, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.